Thank you everyone who's joining the webinar. I'm Laura from the Building Centre and hosting today's Retrofit talks. Just waiting for a few more people to get online because it's just on 1 o'clock. We've got a really nice attendance list and turnout for today's fantastic webinar with ECD Architects and collaborators. So just to kick off by way of introduction, this webinar today is part of our Retrofit 25 season in collaboration with the National Retrofit Hub. So at the Building Centre, we have a venue in central London on Store Street, and we've got the exhibition Retrofit 25, What's Stopping Us, on display there until the 19th of September. You can also view that exhibition as a virtual exhibition on our website, that's buildingcentre.co.uk. So if you can't make it down to our venue, do check that out and look at all the case studies and all the topics that sit within that overarching theme of what's stopping us. But today and for other events in the season, we've been holding online talks, our Retrofit talks, and today's all about the challenges for councils, for local authorities, and it's going to be brought to life through a case study of collaboration. Couldn't say that, too many C's here. So the collaboration that's going to be presented is being led by ECD Architects, who generously support the retrofit programmes at the Building Centre. Lizzy Westmacott is going to be presenting as a collaborative effort alongside Neil Watson and Lorraine Wood. Neil's from Renfrewshire Council and Lorraine's from Best. So I'm going to ask them to come on camera so you can see them. I'll stop screen sharing. And just before I pass over to Lizzy to screen share and present, the way the webinar works is after the presentations, there'll be a Q&A with you, our audience. That will be enabled through the Q&A chat box function at the bottom of your screens. So if you can locate that now, that's good to know. Keep your questions in mind. You can put them in as people are presenting or wait till the end, and then I'll put them to Lizzy, Neil and Lorraine. So that's how we'll run the webinar. So for now, I'm going to come off mic and off camera and hand over to Lizzy to start the session.
Great. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us, and thank you, Laura, for the introduction. We're going to talk about a project that was enabled by Hub West Scotland, who brought us all together, and a team of us helped 3 councils in the kind of greater Glasgow area to understand their non-domestic buildings and to work out how they might go about decarbonising them. Each of the councils has a target date for reaching net zero, but also a bewildering amount of work to do to get there. So we've used a variety of tools to help visualise a route map that aims to allow the councils to integrate retrofit into their ongoing maintenance strategies so that the buildings actually start to get decarbonised. And bringing the councils together meant that we could study a few of their archetypical buildings in quite a lot of detail, and then extrapolate that outcome data across all of the 3 councils' buildings, which kept the cost down for the councils and also the amount of work that we needed to do ourselves. So, but first, before we get started properly, some introductions from your speakers. So, Neil.
Good afternoon. I'm Neil Watson. I've been an architect for 30 years. The last 15 years I've been a project manager and sometimes project director with Renfrewshire Council.
Hi everyone, I'm Lorraine Wood. I'm a performance and data manager at Built Environment Smarter Transformation, also known as BEST.
And I'm Lizzy Westmacott. I'm the Regional Head of Sustainability at ECD Architects in our office up here in Glasgow. And I think just also important to say, there was, of course, a whole team behind this. So the other 2 councils involved, Inverclyde and East Dunbartonshire councils, other people at Renfrewshire Council, other people at Best, a whole group of us at ECD Architects, as well as the services engineers that we worked with, Rybka, and the cost consultants, Doig Smith, and crucially, Hub West Scotland, who kind of brought all this together and guided the process. So I'll do a little bit more introduction of the project, and then Neil's going to talk to you about what's the challenge, why did councils want to do this? Lorraine's going to talk a bit about how we gathered data and why that was important, and then I'll run through the building studies that we carried out and how we then extrapolated that data across the council's properties and created these route maps. And then Neil's going to kind of tie this all up with, so now what? What happens next? So a sort of very brief run through of the methodology of the project as a whole. Lorraine will talk a bit more about how we gathered this data together, but once we got that, we were able to start kind of trying to find correlations within that data that allowed us to suggest archetypical groupings of buildings so that rather than study every building in detail, we could just study a few instances to work out how they could be decarbonised, and then use this outcome data across all the buildings within the archetype. So once we gathered that data, we worked out the final buildings we were going to study. We then went and visited each of those buildings, which in the end was 15 buildings. We created a model in DesignPH, which is a SketchUp plugin of the building. So you create a kind of geometric model of the thermal envelope of the building and also anything that shades the building. And then you apply U values to the elements of that building, and then export it to the path of house planning package, or PHPP. And that gives us an energy model of the existing building, and we could validate that against energy bills. And we then started suggesting retrofit measures, considering the particulars of the building and the level of disruption that might be caused and so on. But we again put that modelling into the PHPP model, including sort of the M&E recommendations as well. And from that, we got out the outcome energy use and carbon data from the retrofitted building at each step of the retrofit. And then also that specification could be costed. And then that data was all fed back into the whole group of buildings. So from our 15 buildings we actually studied, we kind of spread that data across the whole 500 or so buildings across all the council's buildings. And then we work with each council kind of independently. In fact, we're still working with each council independently to create their own kind of personalised route map of what that means for their council. And then also just to put this in sort of geographic context, because I didn't know before I moved to Glasgow a couple of years ago where some of these places were. So there's Glasgow kind of in the middle, and East Dunbartonshire is to the north, Renfrewshire to the west, and Inverclyde to the west of that. So in some ways, they're relatively similar areas in terms of the building stock that they typically have. And that made it much easier to be collaborative and to be able to share the information about one building across all of the stock. I'm going to hand over to Neil now to talk a bit about why this is important to the councils.
Okay, thanks, Lizzie. So the council, Retrofit Council has 238 non-domestic buildings, but buildings isn't really our business. We provide key services to our communities. There's a local authority on the left there. That's what you'll find on page 1 of our website, and our buildings support that delivery of services. Obviously, we have operational and management responsibilities over them. But really, the vital thing for us, top priority, is continuously delivering those services. And any changes to that or disruption to it needs to be really very carefully managed. We do look to continuously improve what we can offer and remain adaptable to changes that come along. And that is a target that we are always working to. But this net zero challenge really is it's a step change that has been asked of our building stock. It's really unprecedented. I think we all are aware and signed up to and full agreement with the political intent, the emergency in the climate. However, reality does bite when we go and look across our estate and see exactly how big the challenge is to upgrade or improve some of the buildings that we have. And we really need to pivot, as the word I've used, to change our view of investment return, that the benefits that we achieve aren't simply a financial return on investment. We have carbon as a currency now, and reducing our emissions and reducing the consumption of carbon is my top priority beneath delivery of services. And really changing our view of that and changing our view of how we make those investment decisions is going to be really important. Maintaining momentum is quite difficult because it's such a huge issue, a huge matter for us to deal with. In order to get momentum in the first place, we have to try and understand the size and shape of the issue. Deadlines turns out not to be deadlines. 2030 in Scotland has somewhat been removed with that target for 2045. We're all hoping we'll achieve what we need to achieve by 2050. But a wee point about kind of not just global or national or local influences, all influences really do affect us as a local authority. And with fixed objectives, that means that we're constantly trying to overcome those obstacles or hurdles. So we have to have a long-term vision and strategies to deliver that. The councils, in my experience, certainly, we are really good at coming up with short-term solutions and solving problems quickly when they arise. Long-term vision is a different matter. We need to have really constructive collaboration and consensus so that we can, with the partners that we have, many partners, and with our communities and with the other agencies that we work closely with, set those priorities and try and make sure that we stick to them against the temptation of short-term solutions. And we've inherited I'll call it a legacy property estate, which is not readily upgraded. The age, condition, the suitability and adaptability across our 238 buildings is very variable, put it that way. And we have to remain responsive to, obviously, demographic change, social changes, technological changes, fleet of foot, if you like, and agile. Embodied carbon and the whole life value of our investments is going to become increasingly important, and respecting that with those 238 buildings already exist, if most of them are still going to exist in 2050, we're going to have to do something about it. We have to respect carbon budgets. We have to give more respect, I think, to reuse and recycling. And we have to make sure that our best value judgments are taking into account what our long-term target is. And we're obviously going to have to change some of our behaviour. We're going to measure and monitor and adjust and improve constantly. But we can't forget that we're a local authority for our local communities. The decisions and solutions that we come up with will be future-proofed, and they need to be coordinated across the council. But we really would like for those operational consumption efficiencies to be benefits locally, and for us to make sure that it's place-centred when we make certain decisions, so that the benefits remain within the areas where we're making those changes. Now, that's an enormous amount of information for us to consider. 238 buildings is an enormous amount of information to consider. So we clearly needed an expert partner to help us with that, and that's where Lizzy comes in.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah, if you just want to move on to the next slide, or is it just a wee bit delayed? There we go. Thank you, Lizzy. Yeah, so I'll talk a bit now about the data work that was undertaken for this project. So from the beginning, it was very clear that everyone involved wanted to have that very clear and sensible strategy for how they would retrofit their non-domestic estates. But with so many different buildings serving all these different purposes and at various sort of conditions, it was agreed early on that we wanted to use real data to understand that baseline and subsequently use data to inform that retrofit strategy. And given the collaborative nature of this project, it was really important for us to work together and create a single source for all of this. So this first diagram shows the process that we went through initially, which was to take a whole load of information that the various councils had on their buildings, which notably across 3 different organisations was held in multiple systems and in all different formats. We then had to convert that into agreed data fields using a unified approach, to then aggregate this data to give us a full picture across the 3 estates, and then use visualization techniques to gain various insights into the data and for any analysis that we wanted to do. Next slide, please. Thanks. Yeah, so this shows the types of data points that we focused on for that initial baselining exercise. So this was based on existing information. So building information, basic stuff such as address, postcode, use type, building characteristics such as size, construction type, and age. We wanted to pull out any special conditions that would significantly impact a retrofit strategy. So things like if the building was listed or if it had a swimming pool, and then any sort of general energy information such as the EPC rating, the fuel type, the space heating demand, and also whether or not there were any on-site renewables already. Next slide, please. So all that effort in creating and completing that new database allowed us to fairly easily then chop that data up in various ways to really understand that wider estate. So this shot here, this is just a very small snapshot of what that initial data collection exercise allows us to create. So I'll just sort of explain some of the stuff we're looking at here. So this set of charts, this is when we looked, if we were looking at the combined estate by size. So that top left tile shows that there is almost 900,000 square metres of space across all 3 councils. The next tile shows how that's split up by council. And the next one shows the split by use type. So perhaps unsurprisingly, given that we're dealing with local authorities, education dominates that estate, then followed by community buildings, then sport and leisure, and so on. Below this, you can see the bottom left chart, that the vast majority of the estate is fueled by gas for heating. And on the bottom right, we have the breakdown of EPCs. So that's just a very quick snapshot of like the type of data that we could look at. We looked at that by size, we could look at it by number of buildings and all other different things in between. Next slide, please. Thanks. So all of this preparatory work got us to the point where we were able to use key data points to characterise each building into an archetype. And that was based on certain building characteristics. So we did look at different options for this, but we settled on using year of construction by banding and construction type. So this chart here on the left shows the spread of those archetypes across the combined estate, and that's then sort of split up by organisation. So what you can see from that is that the archetype coded as Y6C3, which means that it is a building built between 2000 and 2019, and it's of steel frame construction. So that was the most common across the 3 estates, and with 51 buildings meeting that category. And then the second most common was post-war masonry buildings with 49, and then you can sort of see how that continues. So the key to the archetype codes is shown in that top right corner, and then the pie chart underneath shows the the dotted line in the middle sort of cuts off where we are with the top 10. And effectively, we chose to focus on that top 10 for the next part, and that pie chart shows how much of the estate was covered by focusing on this top 10. Next slide, please. Okay, so the reason we wanted to assign archetypes was so that we could understand what a general retrofit approach would look like when applied to groups of similar buildings. So the idea was to complete detailed studies on 1 or 2 from each of the 10 archetypes. As Lizzy mentioned, sort of pull out those key data points from the studies, so things like estimated retrofit cost or carbon reduction, and then apply those baseline figures back into the database to understand how those numbers would, what the implications on the entire estate would be. So we had to decide what buildings we would actually choose to study across the different council areas, and this table shows so we basically used this table to map out the archetypes and then the different use types, and then make sure we had a good spread of studies out across those. So that's kind of all from me at the moment. I have tried to summarise what was a fairly complicated process in a very short amount of time, but hopefully that gives you a flavour of the steps that were taken in relation to data and assigning archetypes. So I'll now hand back to Lizzy, who will tell you a bit more about the building studies. Lizzy.
Thanks very much, Lorraine. So alongside that data gathering and sorting process, we were also working out with the councils how we were actually going to do these studies and what information we would be able to work out for each of the buildings that we studied so that we could extrapolate it across their wider estate. So that was obviously really important, sort of setting a target of how far are we going to go with these retrofits we're proposing. So the councils each have set their own targets for when their whole building estate and all that they do will be net zero, and therefore when they'll need to decarbonise their buildings. And that decarbonising means stopping burning gas, so getting rid of gas boilers. And as Lorraine showed, the vast majority of these buildings are currently heated via gas boilers. But if we just take out the boilers and run the buildings on electricity, even using that electricity to power a heat pump, that will typically still put the energy bills up because electricity is that much more expensive than gas. So for each building, there wasn't a specific target in terms of kilowatt hours or carbon. The target was finding a sweet spot where we do enough fabric retrofit to reduce the total energy use so that when we swap the boiler out for a heat pump, the energy bills won't go up. So you start with your existing building on the left, you add on this fabric retrofit, you add on the heat pump, and Consequently, your bills go down at least slightly, but crucially, the carbon emissions go down. So back to the buildings that we chose, and we picked these buildings, and then we spent a lovely few weeks, or a few days of a few weeks, visiting these various buildings. So we've got a town hall in Milngavie, we've got various schools around the place. We've got a community centre right on the coast at Weems Bay. It's really interesting going around the local area. And as you can see on the top right there, we spent some time in plant rooms in a lot of these buildings. That one's in particularly good condition. Some of them were a bit sketchy. We also hung around buildings with clipboards and measured things, tried to find out what was behind the render. Sometimes the buildings made that very easy because the render had all fallen off. Other times it was a bit more guesstimation going on and trying to find bits of the buildings where we could work out what the construction was. And on the bottom right there, you can see what we found in one of the buildings, which was one of the original architect's drawings for a community centre, where it was obviously mandatory to hang out in flares if you came to visit the community centre. But it was really interesting kind of understanding a bit more about the history of each of the buildings and so on. And while we were in each building, we also made sure that we spoke to some of the building users and those who ran the buildings day to day. So that was both to find out about like the issues that they already have. So is it drafty? Is there a leak somewhere? Have you got a mold issue? Does the boiler break down all the time? And some of those things the councils already knew, but sometimes, you know, speaking to people on the ground can highlight certain things. But we also needed to understand how often the various areas of the buildings are used. So here we've got a plan of a library and community centre, and the different areas are marked up in different colours. And then we've got a schedule that went along with that, showing how much of the time each of those areas is actually in use. And some of the buildings we use really consistently. So schools generally at the kind of full capacity during the school time, but obviously in the summer, they're not much used. Some of the buildings are used far less frequently. So this affects not just how much energy the buildings are going to use in their existing condition, because they might not be heated all the time, for example, but also how we might go about retrofitting them, because disruption is going to matter a lot more to some building uses than others. And for each building that we went to, as I say, we tried to understand how the building was put together, and we produced a sort of sketch section to at least part of the building, demonstrating our understanding of the current building construction. And then once we proposed our retrofit measures, we applied those onto our sketch section to give each council an idea for each of their archetypes, the sorts of measures that we would be proposing. And we also went through and kind of highlighted where the risk areas might be in terms of retrofit. So where we need to be sure that we were really understanding any thermal bridge risk or any water ingress risk or whatever. So that gave them a bit more than just the data. They also had something that informed the specification that we were giving for each archetype. And then using our passive house planning package model, this is an example of the sort of output that we got to do with, so I'm trying to get the output we got to do with the heat demand of each building. So on the left here, we've got the heat demand of an existing building. And on the left of the left-hand graph, we've got all the heat losses from that building. So we're losing a lot of heat through this roof, we're losing quite a lot of heat through the walls, and so on. And then here we've got the gains, the heat gains in that building. So we've got some solar gain, so sun comes in through the windows and heats the building up a bit. A little bit of internal heat gain because people are doing stuff in the building. And then all the rest of the losses need to be made up for by actually putting heat into the building. So using the boiler to heat the building. And then after the retrofit, we've reduced our heat losses quite a lot. So we've insulated the roof, so we've reduced the heat losses through the roof. We've insulated the walls, so we've reduced the heat losses there. We've still got some solar gains, we've still got our internal heat gains, but because our losses are so much lower, we need far less heat to go into the building to keep it at a consistent temperature. So we've managed to reduce that heat demand by 156 kilowatt hours per metre squared per year. And that obviously, that reduction in heat demand itself lowers the carbon emissions, but it also means that when we put the heat pump into the building rather than the boiler, the heat demand will be low enough that both the heat pump can work efficiently, but it will also cost less to run than it's costing to run the boiler at the moment. And as I said earlier on, that target's really critical for the councils. Another graph, I'm afraid. But on the left here, we've got the energy bills of one of the buildings at each proposed retrofit step. And on the right, we've got the carbon emissions for the same steps. So this is our current energy bill around £36,000. And if we just insulated the roof, those bills would drop to around £27,000. If instead we just insulated the walls, so external wall insulation and cavity wall insulation, our bills would drop a bit, but not by quite as much, down to £31,000. And so on and so forth. If we put in just a heat pump and we just took out the gas boiler and put in a heat pump, our bills would shoot up to £52,000. And so it was really important we didn't do this. This is why we're doing all of these fabric retrofit steps as well. I mean, they'll make the buildings more comfortable and probably more durable, but also we need the bills not to go up when we put the heat pump in, because that's not affordable for the councils. Adding PVs also reduces the bills. If we put all these measures together, so we're doing our fabric retrofit, we've got a heat pump in, and we've got our photovoltaic panels, we can see that we're actually managing to bring the energy bills down. And then if we look at the same thing, but in terms of carbon, we've got our existing carbon emissions, 63,000 kilograms of carbon emitted a year by this building. And trying out each different step of the retrofit, you can see the impact on carbon emissions. And you can see that if we just put in the heat pump alone, taking out the boiler and put in the heat pump, it reduces our carbon emissions, that pretty much halves our carbon emissions. But if we do all the things together, we can bring those carbon emissions down to like a quarter or so, maybe a third of what they were before. So this combination of all the measures, not just looking at services, not just looking at fabric, but bringing those together means we can bring both the bills down and the carbon down. So then for each building, we got useful things like the cost of doing these retrofit works and the total carbon savings of these retrofit works. But we also calculated what those were on a per meter squared basis. Because it's all very interesting knowing how much it'll cost to retrofit this particular building. But what we were really interested for the big picture, for this big data picture extrapolation across the estate, was those per meter squared figures, because that's the information that we want to apply to other instances of similar buildings of the same archetype. And similarly, we broke that down further into the heat demand saving, the carbon emission saving, and the cost per measure by the measures. So for the roof, for the walls, for the windows, and so on, so that we could look at each measure kind of independently. And this is a small part of a much bigger table, but we've on the left here, we've got our various buildings. Across the top, we've got the sorts of measures we might be applying. And in this part of the table, we're looking at the grams of carbon saved per pound spent per meter squared of each measure. So it's a very specific breakdown, but this is the kind of data we were then able to apply to all the other buildings. That meant that for every building across all of the council's estate, we had an approximate cost of doing retrofit work, amount of carbon saved, and so on, so that each council could see how much carbon they could save, how much it might cost to achieve that carbon saving, but also start to think about the impact of individual measures within that bigger picture. As I said, this is still currently a bit of a work in progress, but we've so far had some more detailed discussions with one of the councils to create their own kind of council-specific roadmap. So looking at this, in their case, they started off with 93 buildings on the left there, and they're actually planning to, they're already planning to dispose of some of those buildings for various reasons, some of which they'll actually be rebuilding. And I think it made really clear to everyone how imperative it is that any new buildings be net zero, because we can't be creating more problems for ourselves, because we've already got so many buildings we need to decarbonise that anything new has got to be net zero. There are a few buildings in their estate that actually don't have any heating, so like sports pavilions and stuff. And then a few of the buildings are actually already on electric or other fully renewable technology, so they don't need decarbonising. But we've got 54 buildings left that we need to kind of carry out some sort of phased decarbonisation on. And in the case of this council, East Dunbartonshire, their net zero target is set to 2036, so 11 years from now. And we've got to get 54 buildings decarbonised by 11 years from now. So it's a big ask, but not as big as Neil's got to face up to. And then, of course, if we get those buildings off gas and running entirely on electricity, that's great. But there are clearly still some remaining emissions from that electricity. But as we're promised, the electricity grid is going to decarbonise over time. Those emissions will reduce and tail off. So how do we go about thinking about this route map? Even though we've only got one council's building, we've still got our big long list of buildings here. longer than what you can see on the page. And we got from the council when they thought each of those buildings would need their boilers replaced, and those are in this column here. And those highlighted in red won't actually need their boilers being replaced until after the council's target net zero date of 2036. But if the council is going to be net zero by 2036, they'll need to replace the boilers with heat pumps or something similar earlier than 2036. So first off, we started imagining carrying out the full retrofit of each building in the year that its boiler needed replacing. So if the boiler needs replacing in 2029, we put the entire cost of replacing that, of retrofitting that building in 2029. And those whose boilers didn't need replacing until after 2036, so say it was 2043, they'd still get their boiler replaced and all of their retrofit carried out and their boiler replaced in 2036. And on the right here is the 11 years from now to 2036 and the cost on the left. And as you can see, that's not a very happy spend profile for a council, because they don't want to be investing kind of 50 times as much money in one year as in some other years. So we needed to look at that in a bit more detail. So we started looking at spreading the works out over time, so that most of the buildings retrofits got phased over time. A few of them might be done as kind of a one-hit thing if they're in a bit particularly bad condition at the moment, or the way the building's used means that that's the best thing to do. So we phased these buildings, but making sure that the finish date of the retrofit was in time for that boiler to be replaced with a heat pump. And sorry, flip this around, but on the left here then is the spend profile of that. So the cost in each year is much lower than the highest cost we had previously, but the cost each year is quite high. So it's a much more acceptable sort of spread of the spend. It's still quite expensive, but it also acknowledges that retrofits are probably likely to happen over time. Like the council's unlikely to have the money maybe to do all of the retrofit of one building just like that all at once, and that actually if we can start to integrate the retrofit measures with maintenance that's happening to these buildings anyway, so when windows need replacing, they get upgraded. When the roof needs redoing, we get more insulation in there, but we also prepare it for some PVs to be added onto it later. Make sure that the roof overhangs a bit so we can bring some external wall insulation up underneath in the future. And so this kind of phased approach acknowledges that that's a more realistic way for this retrofit to actually take place. And then we used Power BI to create a nice dashboard for the council. So this is going to go into their kind of the council's, I think it's called the carbon action plan or something in their case, but you know, they need to prepare this and share it with the council and share it with people in the local area. So it was important that it kind of looked good and was graphically something people could understand. This is a slightly redacted version, and it's also in fact kind of interactive in the dashboard. But we've just got a few images of it here. But we've kind of set out things like the fact that at the beginning we've got to focus on those buildings that actually need fairly urgent boiler replacement. And then after that, we're able to kind of integrate the maintenance and retrofit a bit more over the rest of the period until 2036. And we've got some sort of key milestones where we got our first building decarbonised. And we're sharing an example of this primary school getting decarbonised over several years between 2029 and 2035. And we're imagining first we insulate the roof better. We add some PVs on top of that roof. We sort out the ventilation with a mechanical ventilation with heat recovery before we then start making the building a bit more airtight by replacing the windows and make sure they're really well installed, and bring in external wall insulation. And then finally, when we've done all of that fabric work and services work, the heat demands reduce really significantly. So we can now put in the heat pump and the energy bills will still be lower. And we also set out for the council, again, we've redacted some of the information here, but which buildings might be retrofitted when. And as soon as we put this on a timeline and kind of put it under their noses, they were like, oh, well, I wouldn't do that then, and I'd move that forward and I'd put that later. But there's nothing like having it written down to bring out people's criticism. But that's really important. If we don't get people talking about it, then it's definitely not going to happen. So just having it kind of drawn and put under people's noses was actually a really critical way to kind of get the conversation going and actually mean that something's happening. And then another thing that we were able to kind of learn from this was to demonstrate that we've got a pipeline of various retrofit works happening over the next 11 years in this case. And and that maybe the council can kind of buy bigger packages of work, and that can make it more cost effective. So for example, in grey here is all the heat pumps being replaced. And, you know, if they can come into some sort of partnership with a heat pump manufacturer or something, maybe they can make that more cost effective. And similarly, the sort of white blobs here, external wall installation being added. So there's a real pipeline of work there. And the other thing that Hub West are trying to get us all talking about is the possibility of the councils working together to kind of procure this and have an even bigger and clearer pipeline of work. So there's definitely exciting next steps to follow. And then finally, for me, just a little sort of silly thing I drew, but it's actually really important to me, it felt, is that what we don't want is that someone sat at their computer in a council office going, oh, well, we just need to patch that roof, so we'll just do that. And I want that, you know, if they're about to press that button and say they're going to do that, like a big red light's going to go off and say, no, you can't do it. That, in fact, you really need to think more carefully, go back to the kind of outline specification we've prepared, and make sure that rather than just doing that little maintenance job, we're actually looking at the bigger picture, looking more strategically, and adding in appropriate retrofit work to that piece of work. And very gratifyingly, one of the councils has already got in touch saying, actually, we need to re-waterproof a couple of our school roofs. It'd be great if you could give us a specification to do that in the right way, rather than the quick way. So that's exciting. And I will just hand over to Neil to kind of wrap up and talk about where this leaves the councils.
Yeah, that last slide of Lizzie's just reminds me of sitting exactly like that and being handed a project to re-roof and re-windows schools 3 years ago, and the red light was in my head, but nonetheless, it's kind of where we came in on this journey, because we are aware that we're going to have to do things differently. We simply can't proceed the way we have been in the past. So this slide I've really described as how we live now. There's no going back to the old ways of doing things, and really we're only looking forward from this point. So our net zero journey has to be how we live now. It has enormous scale and reach, but there are really visible interdependencies between various programmes that the council runs. Imagine that we've got electric car charging, we've got biodiversity projects, we've got a whole range of things which actually are all relevant to projects, and maybe actually supported and helped to be delivered because we've got projects that are already underway. These prime objective priorities need to be set against what we would have set in the past as short-term solutions. And we need to really adjust the way in which we create projects to make sure that we are always looking at our prime objective priorities. It does need a lot of commitment. It needs a set of principles to follow, and it needs very strong leadership. Lizzie touched on some of the risks. Technical risks aren't even on my desk at the moment. It is the other risks around this, and frankly, we need to be addressing them. We need to take them on rather than just identifying and setting to one side. And all of these risks and issues potentially are a challenge to us achieving those targets. So there's other ways of looking at it. We've got to, with everything new that we try to do, that new opportunities will become available, and some of those opportunities will help us in a broader sense in our net zero planning. I want to say on the left, there's just a wee excerpt from our RIN Zero plan for net zero. We've got objectives set by that, and those are quite broad. They're sometimes much broader than simply our property estate, but everything affects everything else now. We need to be really resilient to challenges which are trying to get us to do things the old way, and we are trying to establish the kind of strength of leadership to make sure that everyone is.
Oh, I think Neil might have frozen there. Yeah, I'm not sure we're getting Neil back. I think given we're so close to the end, I will wrap up there. Oh, you're back.
Oh, sorry, did I freeze up? How far have I got? Did I mention RIN Zero?
Yes, you did mention RIN Zero.
Okay, let's go back. Right, so what I'm saying is that net zero standard needs to be applied, but in different ways. So we do have passive house as a standard. We do have a net zero public sector building standard. We do have ECD. We've got a range of different ways of helping us get towards a net zero standard. The top right building is a building in the village of Loch Wynneth. So whilst we have very urban settings within Rybka, we've got quite rural ones. There's many different conditions in which we've got to upgrade our buildings. But that one is a wee listed building that we are not going to be getting rid of. It's critical to the village of Lochwinnoch, but it can't be upgraded perfectly to net zero. So we have to take a balanced estate approach. Some buildings, the next one down is Doig Primary School, completed a couple of years ago, and the bottom one is New Paisley Grammar, currently underway to pass the fresh standard. The one in the bottom left, we're planning for an expansion of a secondary school at Perkins, and that has all been done taking full account of how we try to achieve those standards. The ones that can perform the best, and the biggest ones that can perform the best, will benefit those that can't actually get to the standard. And we have to take that balanced approach, make some strategic compensations and therefore obligations on other projects. We are going to have to significantly enhance our life cycle maintenance programs, and our operational models will really need to change so that we can accommodate all of this change and all of these plans. Every time we identify that something needs done, it has to be ticking off a box in a transition plan for that building. Every investment, every optimization will take us one step forward, and I'm looking forward to be able to report year on year how much we've improved the estate. And those replacement programs that are currently funded may need to be expanded, and someone else will find me the money, and I'm happy to make the case for it. But every incremental efficiency is going to get us towards that carbon target, and I'll remain positive about it.
Thank you so much, Neil. I'll stop sharing my slides now.
Thank you, Lizzie. Thank you, Neil, and thank you, Lorraine. We've got some time for questions. Some of them look quite detailed. So before we get into that, obviously you've presented all the work, and I know it's an ongoing process that you've been doing. A lot of this is about collaboration, but I also thought it seems also it's a bit about that hearts and minds piece that is also one of the topics that's in the Retrofit 25 series. So Neil, you talked about needing that long-term vision and getting everyone to buy in and not press the button, Lizzie, when they kind of could do a quick repair and think about the bigger picture. So how are you doing something more on that, kind of getting everybody else to buy into this process? Is there some kind of learnings on that human side of it as well as the technical
You
side?
want to hear from me on that?
Oh, whoever wants to take it, Neil, you can go.
Okay, from the council's point of view, we have arrangements and we have partnerships with a great many people across our community, businesses and institutions, and we have taken our plans to them for their approval, for consultation. When those plans are approved by the council, then we take back to those partner organisations, institutions, and explain to them, here's how it has to go forward. However, we're still in its kind of infancy, so to some extent, how it works in terms of them taking that instruction or that agreement and delivering it, we're really kind of just at the beginning of how we monitor and support how they will deliver against their targets. But we do need to lead by example, and I think everyone made it clear to us during the consultation process that it would be really beneficial if the council could lead by example and show and illustrate the benefits that can be achieved. It isn't a matter of just saying, oh, it's going to cost us all money. That's certainly not the only currency here. There are benefits, there are opportunities, there are positives that are going to come out of this. And every pound spent is going to work towards that. And get that message out is a really important thing for the council.
Yeah, because like, oh, sorry, Lizzie.
Just the other thing to add, I guess we couldn't have sort of too many people from each council involved all the way through the project. But as we sat down to have those kind of individual route map workshops with each council, we tried to make sure that we're bringing in a range of different people from within the council so that those maintenance people kind of know what this is all about and the people with the purse strings know what this is all about. So obviously it's partly about sort of wider people within the council, but it's also about like wider people sort of who live in the council area, but it's also about the people within the council organisation grasping why suddenly they're not being encouraged just to get that repaired tomorrow, but actually give it a bit longer and think it through.
Yeah, great, super interesting. Thank you again. So we'll move on to audience questions. So there are some technical ones, and I think some of them actually apply more to the next steps, which you probably haven't got to, but we'll do our best with a lot of them. So this one's from Adam Lane. What is the modelling internal set point, and also is the set point the same pre and post retrofit? Lizzie,
we did a bit of playing around, and it depended a bit on how well the building was used. So for some buildings, there was a community centre where they gave us literally their heating timetable. And so we were able to use the Passive House Trust's periodic heating tool to calculate an appropriate average internal temperature to do our modelling against. And in that case, we then did increase that through the steps of the retrofit. So because we envisaged the building hopefully being warmer on average once it's complete. We also, in that case, had some more detailed discussions with the M&E engineer about whether a heat pump was the most appropriate heating system for that building that was used so intermittently. Other buildings such as schools, like you've got a fairly clear idea of when the building's heated. So we did vary that depending on the use of the buildings, but some of them we weren't able to get such detailed information. And the other thing was that in some cases we were able to get energy bills. And in those cases, we could start to tweak the assumed internal temperature to get the energy bills to meet our modelling.
Okay.
So it's quite scientific, but not perfect. And again, to kind of stop the costs spiraling, we didn't do air tightness testing on all the buildings. We didn't do monitoring of all the buildings. There's loads of stuff we'd have loved to have done, but we'd still be discussing the fee proposal, or the councils would have told us to go away. So we didn't do all the things that we might have done, and we acknowledge that there would be benefits to those. And I think as well, if as and when some of these projects might actually go ahead, and in particular if there are buildings which might be sort of a retrofit carried out all at once, we'd obviously really recommend that more detailed surveying is carried out prior to the start of works.
Yeah, that sounds.
I was just going to add to that. The council, I mean, we've got a range of projects and a range of approaches to the net zero issue. This project is a major benefit to us, but across our energy management estate, for example, we're already looking at the benefits of achieving better optimizations. So if the question is about can you operate at a lower indoor temperature, yes, and we are looking at that. And where we can, we're already trying to take advantage of that. When it becomes part of a set point for the specification of one of these projects that Lizzy is identifying, then we'll be more familiar with what those set points need to be. But in terms of optimizations, I would say get on that already, if you can, across your estate.
Yeah. I'm going to move on to the next question from Vicky. So can you clarify if the carbon savings accounted for a whole life cycle carbon or just operational carbon? Obviously that's projections as well.
It was just operational, so we didn't look at embodied carbon. Again, I think it would be great to do so, but in terms of time and fee and so on, it wasn't really viable. But I suppose the other thing to say is, like, we are working at least in how we retain buildings rather than how we replace buildings here. Yeah. So, but I appreciate there's a lot of balancing you can do in the amount of retrofit you go to do and how that impacts the whole life carbon and so on. And there was another part to the question that I've forgotten.
No, I think that was it. You've done good. Okay, just because the questions are now all coming in, so I'm going to go quicker. So from Charlotte Ravenscroft, has skills and workforce availability been a constraint for this plan? And if so, how is that being addressed? Neil, you're nodding.
I'm only nodding because it is a consideration. Obviously, it's a clever question because I think I was mentioning across the broader programme and how this affects broader service delivery. Actually, our engagement with education institutions, higher education, all those other institutions, which potentially supply the workforce that deliver much of this work. Well, obviously that's underway already, and the work that we are looking to do feeds into that process. But in terms of whether it's calculated as part of the projects, I don't imagine so. But it's not. But I think the other, acutely aware of it. Yeah.
Just as we were highlighting like a pipeline of different work, so heat pump replacement or external wall insulation, like that highlights to the councils and to the bigger group of councils, and potentially I know there's similar kind of studies going on in other councils across Scotland, like to the Scottish government, like these are the skills we need and this is the pipeline, and if we're all really going to deliver Scotland's 2045 net zero goal, here it is, and it's not just like, oh yeah, we know there's a big problem, but it's specific. And I guess hopefully like working with people like Best and so on can help to try and create that workforce. But it wasn't factored in, but we do hope that one of the outcomes, as well as giving the councils their plan of what they might be able to do, is that it's clear that there is a need.
Yeah, Yeah, you mentioned Best and Lorraine. I know it's not necessarily your area, but that is something Best are involved in, isn't it? That sort of training and skills piece. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, if anyone's interested in any of that type of thing, please do get in touch with Best. But yeah, kind of reiterating what Lizzy said, the sort of beauty of the outcomes of some of this project is that it really illustrated what that pipeline of work would look like. And if we could possibly get this on a much bigger scale, I think it would be more impactful in preparing us for what comes.
Great. All right, moving on, a question from Richard. Will you be incorporating each project to assess its effect on the net zero performance of the district they sit in to ensure that net zero target will be achieved? So that is statewide, kind of, yeah.
So yeah, I guess,
Yeah.
and I guess the plan is to sort of hand over the dashboard we've made to each of the councils, and then that can be kept up to date.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's difficult to know exactly how that will pan out over time, but that's what we're seeking to do.
Yeah.
There are a great many irons in the fire in terms of how all this is reported. And from our own point of view, we absolutely do want to track that. I did mention every improvement ticks a box on each building's transition plan, if you like, but we have to report that at a national level to the Scottish Government effectively to ensure that we are being tracked on our progress. So every incremental improvement will be recorded and reported.
Yeah, great. I think we were due to finish at 1:45 and we've already gone past that. So I might just close the questions for now, but appreciate everybody who has put questions in the chat box. I'll try and do some behind the scenes magic and get them to Lizzy, Neil and Lorraine to look at later. But really appreciate the presentation today from you three as our speakers. The event has been recorded, so anybody watching who wants to watch back to maybe see the slides again or to share with colleagues and friends, it will be on the Building Centre's YouTube channel shortly. If you are on our YouTube channel, all the other Retrofit, well, not all of them, but most of them, of the Retrofit 25 events, the online recordings and the in-person recordings are there for you to look back on, as are Retrofit 24, which was commercial, cultural and civic retrofit, and Retrofit 23 looking at domestic retrofit. So do look back. We've got an in-person event in London on the 9th of July all about finance and money and how that's one of the issues that we need to unlock to upscale retrofit. So if you can make it, do look and book onto that. It'd be great to see you in person. But final thanks to Lizzy, Neil and Lorraine, and thank you to everyone for attending today. We'll hopefully see you again. Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.